Hello everyone, what we're going to do in this sort of video is look at functionalism and Marxism, what they say about social stratification. Now, with Marxism, hopefully, if you've done the sociological theory unit, which you all should have, and you all have, the question on Marxism there basically is talking about social stratification. The whole ethos, the whole Marxist ideology is talking about social stratification. I will go over it again towards the end of this video, but if you just read your work to familiarise yourself with it, hopefully having watched this video, that might help a bit. But first of all, we're going to look at what functionalism has to say as to why we have social stratification around the world. Now, if you remember with functionalist theory, when we drew the little bodies and put the organs on and said what the brain did, what was the brain of society, what the heart did, what was the heart of society, it's a system theory. It's a structural theory. It's looking at the whole structure within societies in general. So, another thing, and the clue's in the title, functionalism suggests that everything has a function. If it becomes dysfunctional, then it is eventually removed by society. So, what is the function of social stratification? Well, Davis and Moore said society needed social stratification because society, through social differentiation, there's different jobs that need doing, okay? And in order to keep society going, there are some jobs that are more important. So doctors, okay, some teachers, for instance, although as we'll come on to, they can hardly be called the super class teachers. And because of that, these positions, they require special talents. Again, doesn't really apply to most of the teachers I know. And not generally, you don't get them, they're not widespread in the population. So what you need to do is allow people to develop these talents and encourage them to develop these talents. Therefore, right, these important positions, or so they're classified as by Davis and Moore, you must reward them more. Okay, in Cuba, for instance, when I was last there, you would get a doctor who was on less money, mostly because of the tipping, through people that worked in tourism, like bus drivers, tour guides, bartenders. And that was in Valedero, which is, I think, just about the only place in Cuba where there's a lot of hotels. So what they've done there is, in that society, what's the point of being a doctor? Now, the functionalists would say, well, you have to make a point to being a doctor. You have to give rewards for being a doctor in the form of money and prestige. So if we look at Parsons, I'll show you a photo of him if you've not already seen him in the next slide. He said you have, as we've mentioned before when we first looked at functionalism, you need a value consensus where members of a society generally come to an agreement about what is good. Now, stratification for Parsons, it comes from these common values. So individuals, there is a value consensus, and that they will evaluate somebody's role within that society and they will give it more or less importance, i.e. will rank it in some sort of order, which is stratification. And as Parsons states, stratification is the ranking of units in a social system in accordance with the common value system. Now, please, unless you're going to do sociology, where you might have to, I pity you, Talcott Parsons' books are infamously, shall we say, heavy on the text. They're quite difficult to read, but by all means read it. One of his books is called The Social Structure. I've got it on my bookshelf at home and never move it. Right, so here he is, bald guy with a moustache. So, meritocratic. So what's that? Well, society, apparently, we live in a meritocracy, and is what I will discuss later. I don't think that that's the case. So people get to where they are based on their merits, based on their skills and abilities. So people have got to become doctors, politicians, leaders, top civil servants, etc. And they are there because society's meritocratic and as they deserve to be there. I think we can see a fundamental issue with that already, which we'll come on to soon. So some positions, so like the previous authors that we first started talking about, they have more function than others. So we need people with specialist skills to do that. But we also need, people without specialist skills to do the menial, as Parsons says, not my word, positions within society. So people who deserve it get to the top. People who don't, we still need them. Right? They are at the bottom, they do the menial jobs. When we come on to just go back over the underclass shortly, you should see that a lot of people think we don't need the underclass. They are the lumpen proletariat, the scum that can be taken off the top of the, I don't know, pond or whatever, wherever you find scum, right? So that's what he says. We need occupational difference, different skills, different abilities, and society's meritocratic. You get to where you deserve to get. Right, so Davis and Moore, they came up with a functional model of social stratification. I'm not going to read these out, you can all read. So these, they're talking here about how the qualified should be rewarded, essentially. So, and what's the point of spending time getting to the top, going to university a lot of the time, studying really hard, working really hard, up all night, revising. What's the point of doing that if you're just going to get the same at the end of it as somebody that's done none of that and has just taken an easy life? This is for Davis and Moore, by the way, not me. Right? So, the inducements, they're the things that make you want to try your best, want to be the best you can be, and the best people in terms of their skills and abilities. They have incentives to try and use those, and so they will get paid more, go on holiday lots, etc. So because of that, they have more of the money, more of the property. They tend to have more elaborate leisure activities, and therefore, for Davis and Moore, inequality is inevitable and necessary and desirable. Make of that what you will. So, I'm going to, if you pause the video here, and before you do so, there's a place on Moodle, it's a discussion forum under, surprise, the social stratification area, and I want you to post your ideas on there and we can share ideas, okay? So 100, 200 words, knock yourself out if you want, but you don't go crazy. You can attach Word documents to your post if you want to just type up in Word. Right, so how does social class affect your identity? That's a typing error. That's what you get for not proofreading your work. So I've done that deliberately, by the way. Right, how does social class affect your identity? So, what is it about your social class that makes you who you are? Now, an interesting author, somebody who looked at this, was a French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu, and he came up with a concept, and I may have mentioned this to you, called habitus. And he said, your social class, so where you're born, into what sort of level of finance, financial capital, social capital, cultural capital, that affects your identity. So even if you get rich, I think I've used the idea of Wayne Rooney, he still acts like, he was when he was poor, when he was in Toxteth. So his social class, his upbringing, has affected his identity. Perhaps if he'd been born into more affluent part of Britain, more affluent parents, more luxuries, that might have changed his identity. So how does social class, where you were born, your upbringing, the school you went to, etc., how has that affected who you are? You can get personal if you want, or if you're not comfortable with sharing stuff, don't get personal. Choice is yours. All right, but definitely put it on the discussion forum. That's how we're doing remote working. Right, so now we're going to move on to Marxism. I'll skate through just a kind of summary of Marxism. To be honest, I'm simply repeating what we did in the first unit, so I'll not spend too long on this. Right, so there's a quote for the big man: capital is dead labour, which vampire-like lives only by sucking labour, living labour, and lives the more. Oh, I can't even read that. Right, yeah, and there's a typing error in that as well. I'm not happy. Right, just to recap it, right? So you've got social stratification, and in the system, the capitalist system, we have the exploiters and the exploited, and the ruling class and the subject class, or the middle upper classes and the working classes. And the lower classes, the exploited, they perform more labour to produce the goods that are needed, whereas the exploiter, they exploit in order to produce the goods that are needed for society. And the example there is of a miner, physical labour all day, very, very little pay in comparison to the manager, who in some, like in Australia, a place I know well, they are not hundreds of thousands, some of them, they're millionaires, some of these managers. Right, so Marxists always talk about alienation. That's where, because of the lack of control the bulk of people have over their lives, you get to a situation where people become removed from their own humanity. They become isolated. They've lost control. So you've got this stratification mechanism whereby people have just, their lives are outside of what they want them to be, what perhaps should be, and it's not very nice. I was going to say something else then, but this was going on in the middle. Right, so here we have the classes under capitalism, basically the strata. And this is what Marx came up with: the proletariat bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, the lumpen proletariat, the landlords, who are a throwback to feudalism, and the peasants, again, a throwback to feudalism. And in the Industrial Revolution, many of them left the countryside, moved to urban areas, and became the proletariat. Right, so class consciousness, in order to get rid of this social strata, everybody's the same, whether you think that's possible or not, that's up to you. You have to achieve class consciousness, to wake up, to start the revolution, to destroy the bourgeoisie, to take what they have and distribute it evenly throughout society. That's how you get rid of social stratification. So for Marx, unlike the functionalists, social stratification does have a function, and there's a comparison slide. However, its function is to keep society unequal, which for him is a very bad thing, and it should be removed. We don't need to keep it, like the functionalists say. Right, so there is Marx on ideology. So it's quite a bit there to read. So I will just allow you to read that. So yeah, there Marx and Engels talk about ideology, how we think that social stratification is inevitable, basically. You could pause it if you want to read in more detail and have a think about it. So here's what we're talking about. So this is the base and the superstructure. So you've got the superstructure is all the institutions within society, so like the functional parts of the body, as it were, but Marx brings in the base. Everything in society, as it stands and has always been until the communist revolution, the end of history, throughout human history, everything in society has been known as based on the economic base, the economic activities that people do and complete. So now, finally, we're going to talk about the underclass and the superclass, or the underclass and the elites, the have-lots, if you like. So you've got the have-nots and the have-lots, and people in the middle, the haves. Okay, now the underclass, we went through when we looked at the way they're depicted in the media. We looked at what Charles Murray said about the underclass in terms of how it was a culture, it was individuals' fault that they were in a lower position, and what other people say about the underclass, sort of Marxists in particular, that they're there because of the structure of society, i.e. the base and the superstructure. Right? So we have looked at that, and the PowerPoint is on Moodle. Now, the superclass, you can probably understand what these means, but I'd just like to read some quotes off you. Now, this is in the blue folder on Moodle. There's a PDF document called Elite Theory. Right. Now, if you remember a few years ago, but you guys are probably all about 5, maybe not all of you, but there was the 3 leading politicians were David Cameron, Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg. All went to private schools. All went to what you call Oxbridge, Oxford and Cambridge. So here's what these powerful men have got to say about the unjust society. Cameron, you only have to look at the makeup of the levels of Parliament, the judiciary, the army, the media. It's not as diverse. There's not as much social mobility as there needs to be. Miliband, despite all the efforts of the last few generations to open Britain up, the doors of opportunity are open much wider for a wealthy and privileged few than they are for the many. Clegg, our society is still too closed, too static. A society that still says where you were born, who you're born to matters for the rest of your life. The irony of those 3 statements is deafening. But what they're talking about, that last part from Clegg, where you're born, who you're born to, something like the wealthy and privileged few from Miliband, from Cameron, the makeup of high levels of parliament, the judiciary, the army, the media, just in terms of the roles people have. Now, the superclass, another definition of it is that it is basically, celebrities. Not just celebrities, but newspaper moguls. Richard Branson, who's sort of a billionaire, but also a celebrity. So these elites. But then if we look at Britain's elites, so I'm just going to go through it. Again, this is from the same document I've just been quoting from. Now, if we look at the percentage of the general public, so everyone in Britain who went to independent or private schools, it is 7% of the public. Now, that doesn't all mean like Eton and Harrow. There are smaller independent private schools that aren't as affluent and prestigious. But nevertheless, 7% of the public as a whole. So I'm just going to go through a few jobs, okay, and just if we were in a totally equal society, every one of these jobs would also be at 7%. So senior judges, 71% of them went to private schools, 10 times the national average. 62% of senior armed forces officers, 55% of senior public servants, 53% of diplomats, 50%, half of the House of Lords, 75% of people who chair public bodies, 43% newspaper columnists, read The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, 36% of the cabinet, 35% of the national rugby team, the English national rugby team, and a third of MPs. So 1/3, so that's nearly 5 times the national average of MPs are from private school backgrounds. Now, these figures are from a report in 2014. Now we're talking about Oxbridge, right? Less than 1% of the population as a whole in 2014, less than 1% went to Oxford or Cambridge. So let's have a look at a few other jobs. So 75% of senior judges. Well, less than 1%, 75%. 33% of the shadow cabinet, the Labour cabinet, a quarter of MPs, roughly, nearly 40% of the House of Lords, nearly 50% newspaper columnists, and a quarter of all MPs. So you can just see the disparity, right, between one part of society and the other. Now, if we're living in a meritocracy, okay, this superclass would be made by people from all backgrounds, but it's not. A high percentage of them went to private schools and Oxford and Cambridge universities. So for me, that's not a meritocracy at all. Okay, guys. Now, I've emailed you all the assignment brief on the 18th of March in the year of our Lord, the 18th of March. So that's basically how I want you to go about it. So there won't be an exam. We've cleared it with the exam board, the awarding body, Open Awards, and we don't have to do an exam. So woohoo, no exam, and it's just one assignment with those 4 tasks or questions in. So 2 of those questions will be covering what we've looked at today. Now this is a very ad hoc thing I put together because might not be back at work for a while, but hopefully it's just like, if you were in the room. Yeah, that's what it's meant to be like. All right then, guys. Keep safe, keep well. As they say in Star Trek, live long and prosper.